Was running for mayor and who lost the race last night, Mitch Landrieu, one of his great aunts lived on Adams Street, right next to where my grandparents lived. I went over this one time with Moon Landrieu. He couldn't get over. He called Verna. He said, "Verna, come here. You know who she knew? Aunt Bertha." Aunt Bertha. Aunt Bertha used to make coconut pralines, she called them, every year around Christmas, and she'd bring us a dish. And I thought, oh, I don't like those all coconut. But she always brought them. Always brought him. And
what about your grandparents?
I only knew one grandparent, my mother's mother, my mayor. Now that's an interesting story. The mayor's mother had a plantation that went from Almoniston to Elysian Fields, St. Claude. I forget how far back that went. Imagine that.
It's huge.
True. True. And my mother says that her grandmother was a very, very mean lady. She had a lot of slaves, and she treated them very cruelly. Of course, I never knew her, and I never got to know my father's mother and father. And my grandfather, my mother's maiden name was Babin. She was Odile Therese Babin, as the French say, Babin. And anyway, what did I start to tell you now about that? Oh, my grandfather, he died. He was just in his 40s when he died. They had already had 10 children, imagine. But he developed meningitis, and the doctors thought he had like the flu or a bad cold. But if they had known what they know now, they could have saved him, but that wasn't the way it turned out. And so I had one uncle. My father had one brother, and that's all. It was he and his brother. And I pray for all of these people every night. I say a prayer for the safe repose of the souls of William Weintraub and my Babin uncles, Harry, Paul, Willie, Noel, and Ernest, and my Babin aunts, Louise, Isabel, John Owens, and Maud Henry. Because I figure, who else is going to pray for him?
Where were they from? Where were the Babins from?
The Babins, now some of them came over here with grants from the King of Spain, and they settled in Lafitte. And I've even heard that I've got some connection to Lafitte the pirate. So maybe that's where my rascaliness comes from. But then there was another part of the family that came from France. In fact, around the time of the First World War, my mayor and my grandfather were notified that they had inherited 2 castles. Now this is all true in France. So my Uncle Ernest was over there as a soldier, and another cousin who I always called Aunt Laurence, she went over there and met him, and they looked into this and found out it was indeed true. But my grandfather would have had to produce his original birth certificate, and he couldn't do that because the church in Plaquemine had burned down, and they could give him like a certified copy, but he couldn't get the original. So the government of France said, you can't give us our original. This property reverts to the government of France. So I probably will never know anything more about that than the fact that it was actually so.
Where did you, what street did you live on when you were a little girl? Where'd you grow up?
I lived on, at one time it was called Elm Street. Elm was between Broadway and Carrollton. And if you look down in the sidewalk, you see the
name?
Yeah, you see the name Elm, like in tiles.
Mm-hmm.
But then it became Ferret. And so Ferret goes a long, long ways, but it took in that portion that was Elm. And I guess the reason it was called Elm is because that street has elm trees growing on both sides of it. But I grew up, the first 6 years of my life, I lived at 1000 Adams Street, which was a property that my father's aunt owned. That little house right now is still standing there. It has to be, I'm going to guess it's 150 or more years old. And then we had a fire on my 6th birthday. And my Uncle Ernest and my Uncle Noel, they built a new house for my mother and father on part of the land that we owned that fronted on Ferret Street, on Elm Street. And I lived there until I got married. Didn't get married until I was 31. And then my husband and I had an apartment on Coliseum Street for a year. Then we bought a house in Jefferson Park, and we stayed there for 5 years. But we were having children, and we either had to add on to the house or do something else. So then we contracted, bought a piece of land in Gentilly Lakefront area, 1727 Mendez, and that's where I lived until Katrina.
Well, where did you go to school as a child?
I went to Matador Rosa. I did everything in Matador Rosa. I was married at Matador Rosa. And the pastor of St. Louis Cathedral married us because my husband had lived in an apartment in the French Quarter before we were married, and he was very good friends with Father Burns. And we were supposed to be married by Father Joseph, who was the pastor of Matador Rosa, but he wasn't feeling that well that morning. And so suddenly appears Father Burns, who we had invited to the wedding. And I was so nervous. I had a pretty linen and lace white handkerchief, and I'm just tearing it up. I had all little shreds. I was so nervous about getting married. I thought, how am I ever going to deal with this? I'm used to taking care of myself. And have somebody who's going to take care of me, I don't know if that's going to work. But it worked just fine. Worked just fine. And so I would have been married 50 years in 2003. No, 2001. Because I got married when I was 31. My birthday, I was born August the 27th, 1920.
And where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school at Dominican, which is right down the street from here. And those were the 4 best years. I used to think to myself, and even when I was in college, I thought, life is really just a bowl of cherries. But like I've said many times, then I found out about the pits in those cherries. Then, after I graduated from Dominican, I went to, it was Margaret C. Hansen, and it had always been known as Margaret C. Hansen Normal School. That's where you learn to be a school teacher. But for the period that I went, it had become a 3-year course. And we were supposed to be literally like drawn into the LSU system. But in 3 years, it's just like today in a way, the funds were not there. And so then we got our lifetime teaching certificates. We were qualified to teach in the New Orleans public school system. And then most of us decided to go on and go further. That's when I first started at Loyola. So I really accumulated about, before it was all over, about 5.5 years of college. And I guess my favorite professor at Loyola was Dr. Arnold. And I really did like biology. And all the, not all, but many of the Loyola basketball players were in my biology class. And whether it was right or not, they would always come and copy all my notes.
No.
And my drawings. I could still see all these big guys, you know. And then I wanted to keep...
Some things never change.
Huh?
Some things
That's
never
what
change.
I say. Some things never change, you know. But anyway, then, of course, I taught for those 2 years, and then I had this wonderful experience with the Navy. In fact, in the drafting room, I was the only woman. I was the only female. And there is a judge in this building, Marcel Liverday Jr., and it was his father who was the head of the drafting room. A dear, dear man.
Did you continue working that job after the war?
Well, yeah, briefly. But they wanted to keep on promoting me, and I thought, we're going to reach a point where I'm not even going to qualify for what you're going to give me. And then I was kind of tired of crossing the river because they had moved us from the east bank to the west bank. And I crossed that river every day for maybe 5 years.
On the ferry?
On a ferry. And when you're young, you deal with danger in a different way. It just didn't bother me, you know, driving on that ferry every morning, and when the weather would go into winter and there'd be a lot of fog, and the way we crossed the river was they had a bell, in other words, and it was the sound of that bell that was supposed to protect the ferry from being hit by ships. When you think about that, you know, I mean, that's dangerous. But, and then, like I say, I met my husband when I was still working for the Navy, and just by coincidence, he was 10th Naval District Public Works, and I was 8th Naval District Public Works. And so, anyway, I took a job with Shell Oil Company, and I worked in their drafting room in the exploration department, and my job was to spot well locations and do a lot of lettering. In fact, I used to get picked up lots of times from across the river, and they would drive me over here to the Corps of Engineers, and I would do their organization charts. Then they'd bring the car back again and take me back across the river. And I thought I was very important.
Well, it sounds like you could walk or ride the streetcar to just about everywhere you needed to go in your younger
That's what
days.
he did. In fact, when we had the fire on Adams Street, my father had 2 cars. He had just bought a new car. I don't know how many of you would even recognize the name. It was called an Overland. It's way before the time of many of you. And he had a Ford, a Model T Ford. It had lanterns for lights on either side and isinglass curtains that covered the windows. And my father was a musician, but his real job was working for this, it was called a dry goods business, Schwartz Brothers, at the foot of Canal Street. It later became, that building was used for, I think it was United Glass. But Schwartz Brothers was like the forerunner of Maison Blanche. And the president of Schwartz Brothers, I think, was the first president of Maison Blanche. But at night he was a musician, and he played the French horn, the trumpet, the banjo, and the violin. And my mother played the piano. And they played at the, I think it was the Sanger Theater, before they had sound, and they would have music. My father played the violin and my mother played the piano. And then in grammar school I learned to play the saxophone, which I didn't think was very ladylike. But anyway, I got to be fairly good at it. I did that at Mount Del Rosa. and I played in the band, and we had an orchestra also at Dominican. Played in both of those. And my brother played the trumpet. And every time cousins would come to visit us, they'd say, "Oh, play something for us." And we'd all have to, the four of us, my mother, my father, my brother, and I would sit there. And my father always had a lot of music for these groups that he played. In fact, he had a little orchestra at one time. They called themselves the Pheasants. And my mother used to put these little earpieces in my ear, and I can remember sitting in the kitchen to listen to my father and his band play.
Did they play dance music?
Yeah, they play dance music. One piece they used to play, and I don't know how many of you have ever heard about. I'm a ding-dong daddy from Dumas, and you ought to see me do my stuff. But my daddy belonged to this music club, Leo Feist, they called it, and they would send him the arrangements for all the musicians. I still had some of that in the attic on Mendez Drive.
So, did they ever play on the radio or anything like that?
Yeah, they played on the radio. In fact, that's what I was listening to.
Oh, I see.
Playing on the radio.
Okay.
But then they played at the country club, and they played for functions, and they practiced at my house once a week. And the neighbors would all come and sit around on the porch and the steps and out on the grass to listen to the music, listen to them play, you know. So I grew up with music. When my father would come home in the evening from work, he'd get cleaned up a little bit, and then my mother had to have dinner ready. We ate at a certain time. Then after that, he would play whatever for an hour or two. And so it was like I was conditioned to music, you know? Because when my youngest one, Robert, graduated from Loyola in voice performance, then he went on to Boston University and he has a master's in voice performance. And people would say to me, "But he's always singing or he's playing something. How can you stand that?" I said, "I don't know any different. That's the way I grew up, you know." It wasn't a bad way, it was a good way.
Yeah.
And we weren't rich. In fact, we were more on the poor side, but I thought everybody was like that, you know? It was just as happy. I guess that's why I was thinking everybody.
You grew up during the Depression. Did that?
I grew up during the Depression. My father lost his job. Yeah, and you know, he and my mother, they scrimped and saved and did things. My mother raised, I can remember, she raised canaries on the back porch. She had all these cages that lined the walls, and I think, yeah, she had about 300 canaries. She had lovebirds, she had some kind of exotic birds, but mostly canaries, and she'd sell them. And sometimes I'd help her. We'd have to take we'd line the cages with newspaper, and that newspaper would get real smelly after a while. And I'd have to pull that newspaper out, help her pull the newspaper out, put fresh newspaper in there. And then she'd hard-boil eggs and chop up those eggs, and that's what the birds ate.
Oh.
Did you know that?
Nope.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any brothers and sisters?
I have one brother, Noel, and during the war, he was going to Perkinston Junior College in Mississippi, and